data center developers are wanting bigger centers, some of them talking about the possibility of 1 gigawatt of capacity or more with quicker ramp up times. What have you seen in terms of data center demand in recent months when it comes to the size of the proposed centers and the pace at which they want to ramp up?
Well, we're seeing a little bit of both. We're seeing what we would have typically described as the on-grid data centers, and these are the data centers that you see in Northern Virginia and a lot of other places that have proliferated. And those are the data centers that handle your Facebook accounts, all the commercial accounts, and they're servicing customers. And they're generally located on the utility grid. The new addition here is after AI technology started to get developed, ChatGPT and some of these other things, the big AI data centers tend to be on a scale that is 5 or 10 times larger than the traditional data center that's been on the grid. And so those things are approaching a gigawatt or sometimes more aspirationally of power. So call it 10 times or better the typical data center we might have seen 3 or 4 years ago. And they're going to handle things like trying to figure out the next generation of cancer fighting drugs or innovations in material science or other things where they need that computational power to absorb all of the learnings that humanity has gotten to date and then advance those learnings.
And in terms of how quickly they want to get online, is that changing, or how quickly could you see these very large load customers coming online for Constellation?
I could certainly see it over the next 3 years beginning to happen. There's a lot of study work, engineering study work, land acquisition, other things that we need to do in order to make it happen. But I think a 3-year window is the right window to look at for actually starting to bring on some of these data centers. But they're really big and complicated projects. And as I said, we have to go through a lot of study work to ensure that we could co-locate, that is, bring the data center very close to the plant. And that makes sense because you don't have to build these massive transmission lines that people tend to hate.
Sure.
And you bring that energy consumption right near the place of production. You could limit the amount of wires that you have to build. It becomes far more efficient, more cost effective. But all of that interconnection work has to prove out to ensure that we're continuing to maintain grid reliability.
Okay, and so far this year, has Constellation signed any contracts with data centers? Is it close to doing so? What do those talks look like?
Last year, we did a landmark deal with Microsoft, where Microsoft, again, historically was focused on renewables and wanted to firm that power up that is provided 24/7 regionally. And so we started a partnership with them where, if you kind of think about it, their nuclear megawatts fill in the blanks when renewables don't operate, when the wind isn't blowing or the sun isn't out. And we could give them a product that is a 24/7 product. And we're continuing to see a demand for that product from other data center companies. And we are entering into contracts, but we're also entering into contracts with the McCormick spices of the world for the same sort of thing. And that's a very interesting product for a lot of folks. In terms of the big data centers that you just mentioned, the gigawatt or more, we have yet to announce one of those deals, but you listen to our earnings call and you know that we're fairly deep in discussions with a number of other companies that are interested in doing that.
Okay, we've got, let's see, a question from someone who is tuning in. Let's see. They have here. Okay, so audience question: what do you foresee for the magnitude of on upcoming data center demand and when this demand will hit? This person says they're interested in PJM, but also RTOs in the Southeast US.
We think that the demand will come on more slowly than folks anticipate, which is good because it'll give the grid time to react with new forms of supply to meet that growing demand. But it's pretty hard to build these massive data centers, but we're certainly seeing significant growth. I would have said, to put it in perspective for your audience, I would have said that if we take the electric vehicle demand that we anticipate seeing over the next 10 years, we would think that the data center demand is roughly 3x of that. Now, unlike electric vehicles, which tend to be peaking load depending on when folks charge them, the data center load is far more consistent, so it's a bit easier to serve for the grid than electric vehicles. But in terms of size, it's 3x electric vehicles or even more.
Okay, what would that be? I'm not sure, just in terms of a capacity standpoint, what does that look like gigawatt wise?
You know, I have seen some different estimates. I think in the next 10 years, we could see 10 to 20 gigawatts of additional energy demand in PJM. And but it's going to be, you know, very region to region specific. And by that, I mean regions that are already tight from a supply demand fundamentals perspective are probably not going to see these big data center projects. It's going to go to places where there's an abundance of energy. So PJM has benefited from a significant renewable build out, a significant natural gas build out, and probably the most robust in the nation grouping of nuclear plants. And so that's a really good match for the data center load to come to PJM. And PJM, for folks who aren't familiar with the terminology, is this electric region that's the largest in the country that spans from Illinois all the way to the mid-Atlantic states.
Okay, and so just kind of focusing in on a similar question, but for Constellation specifically, I mean, in order to capture the growing demand that you see on the table for the next several years, or ramping up over the next several years, how much does Constellation need to grow? What are your thoughts for first, just does it need to grow, and if so, how much?
And I would say it needs to maintain and grow. So Layla, probably the most significant issue in energy that we're going to confront as we deal with the energy transition is whether we continue to operate the existing fleet of nuclear plants, which we believe could operate through 2060 and beyond, frankly. But that's going to require investment. Those plants need underground cable and pipes and pumps and all sorts of things to be invested in and replace those things. So these customers are actually willing to support the relicense of those facilities, and they produce about 50% of the carbon-free energy in America today. But more importantly, they represent one of the only carbon-free sources of power that's reliable and predictable, runs 24/7. So as we think about the energy transition as needing not just clean energy, but clean energy that is very predictable, because we have to run the grid in a very predictable way, then nuclear plays perhaps the most important role in the energy transition to supplement what we are doing with renewables. So one of the things that Constellation is focused on is relicensing its assets. And frankly, there's been great support by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission now, as well as the NRC, to do exactly that. President Trump was probably the first to identify the need for continuing support of the nuclear plants, but the Biden administration really has followed and put a number of policies in place. So for the first time in a long time, we have both political parties strongly supporting not only the existing fleet, but developing new megawatts of nuclear. And in that vein, we're doing a few things. We are expanding the output of our plants. As we change over equipment, we tend to get better materials, better efficiencies, and all sorts of things, generators, pumps, everything. That allows us to increase the output of the machines and put on the grid almost immediately, at least in power terms, over a handful of years, new firm clean energy. And then we're also investigating the next generation of small modular reactors or large-scale nuclear plants, as well as natural gas with full carbon sequestration. Constellation was a company that pioneered the net power technology, a new natural gas-fired technology that pairs very well with full carbon sequestration. So we think that technology certainly has legs. So we're working on a number of fronts. But to answer your question, we've got to keep what we have and we've got to grow it if we're going to maintain our position as the nation's largest provider of clean energy and meet all the needs of families and businesses, including this data center demand.
So into specifics with growth, you mentioned on your earnings call again last month, or somebody did on that call, that Constellation has received or announced license extensions at 5 power plants, and it has power uprates or expansions and improvements on existing sites at 2, I believe, Byron and Braidwood. So is Constellation planning to or currently requesting license extensions at any more of its plants?
We're now going through the process, the planning process. There's a lot of study work, engineering study work that needs to go into these applications, but right now, with the demand, frankly, for 24/7 clean power, we think as long as customers are asking for that supply, we can make it happen at all of our sites. In addition, we think that we could create uprates or expanded capacity at plants and do different things to bring on well over 1,000 megawatts of new clean firm energy. I think what we are capable of doing in the next 5 years in terms of 24/7 clean power is greater than any other company in America.
You know, Constellation, as you well know, has been active in acquisitions. Just last year, you oversaw the company as it acquired NRG's ownership stake in the South Texas nuclear power plant in a $1.75 billion deal. So in terms of driving growth, how much of that do you see being through more acquisitions?
I think right now, everyone who has a nuclear plant wants to hold to it. They understand these things have become quite precious from a reliability and energy transition perspective. So I think the opportunities to grow inorganically through merger and acquisition in terms of buying other nuclear plants is at this point not something that we see really happening over the next few years. So all of our growth is going to be organic growth, relicensing plants, increasing their output, and then exploring new next-gen forms of clean energy.
Okay, that's interesting. So to organic growth and what Constellation already has and can do. I know there's been some interest in whether or not it's considering or how seriously it may be considering restarting 3 Mile Island. Can you provide any updates on what your talks are around that these days?
We've gone through an engineering analysis of 3 Mile Island to make sure that we can restart it. There's a lot of work that would need to be done, but we think it's well within our capabilities. So we've answered that first fundamental question. Can we turn the machine back on? The answer is yes. The state of Michigan has strongly supported the Palisades plant that restarted. And I think in terms of restarts, we're really talking about these 2 units, 3 Mile Island plant and the Palisades plant. You know, what's interesting is we all know the history of 1 unit at 3 Mile Island, which Constellation never owned. But what Americans don't understand is the second unit at 3 Mile Island ended up being one of the best performers in the industry. Of our 20 plus units, that unit was far and away the best performing unit for all of us in terms of reliability, safety, efficiency, all across the board metrics. So it's a great candidate to restart. As I said, we've gone through the engineering decisions. At this point, what we would start to look for is whether or not we could have clients for the sale of that power if we were to restart it. So we'll start going through that commercial evaluation and then and to perhaps make a decision at some point in time. It's an exciting opportunity. I was super excited to see what happened with Palisades. Keep in mind, over the last 10 years, we've only brought on 2 nuclear units. And some reports indicate that those have been as much as $20 billion apiece to build. So the ability to restart a unit, a fraction of those costs, create an environment where you can do all the state-of-the-art upgrades to the unit to allow it to be able to run for decades more. That's an incredibly valuable opportunity for America. We understand that. We'll work with stakeholders, we'll work with customers. But as I said, the first most important question was, can it be done? We now could confidently say, absolutely.
And is there any precedent for that type of restart? My understanding is that there's not. I mean, just in terms of like physically going through what it takes to resuscitate infrastructure like that.
Actually, TVA did it a number of years ago for units that had been shut down for far longer than TMI and Palisades. So yeah, there is a pathway, and Palisades is demonstrating that once again.
Okay, so several questions coming in from the audience. We'll get to SMRs shortly. There's a few on that. Let's see here. How would you balance the typical longer lead times, more CapEx required for nuclear buildouts compared to solar and storage?
Yeah, I think they're both becoming significant lead time items. I think with our solar business, one of the questions is where we're going to site the solar panels from, and where the developers we work with are going to be able to site that, as there's increasing pressure from policymakers not to buy those materials from China and other places that may be geopolitically sensitive. So we're seeing some pressures on that. There's pressures in terms of getting transformers and other pieces of equipment. But you're right. I mean, the components in nuclear plants, just because of the amount of power output they can provide, tend to be much larger. They tend to be specialized pieces of equipment that only a few manufacturers on the planet could provide. So you have to be able to make these decisions in the early going, or you're just going to miss your time frames. So what we do is we look at each one of these opportunities, and as you would imagine, we identify those long lead time items because those are going to be the critical path items for a restart. And often we're going to start procuring those early in anticipation of being able to do the relicensing, the upgrade, or other things that we intend to do. We would do the same with TMI.
Okay. Just curious about where are these suppliers generally, like globally? Are there domestic suppliers of such components?
No, sure, for sure. Fuel ends up being a long lead time item. Westinghouse, GE, others, Framatome provide that fuel domestically. Other critical pieces of equipment like the turbines, cables, pumps are a combination of European and domestic suppliers. Companies like a Siemens, as an example, are a big partner for us.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense. Let's see. I don't want to leave too many of these questions coming from the audience out in the cold. On growth, here's a question that just came in. Is there any challenge to your current growth plan that you foresee, or anything that you'd like to see in order to accelerate your path?
Great question. I think in terms of the kind of the nuts and bolts, what we have to do to execute the growth plan, I think it's customer demand. So talking to different customers, getting those deals signed up. But I'm pretty confident that there's interest in what Constellation is doing. That's kind of evident by the performance of the company. I think public policy becomes a really critical thing to keep an eye on, especially as we're getting closer to the November election. So what happens with the Inflation Reduction Act and other state policies that have been put in place that actually support these different industries. If President Trump were to be reelected, does he come in with a fundamentally different view that would undermine perhaps some of the investment decisions that have already been made? That's a thing to be very watchful of, I think. Fortunately, as I said there, I think in terms of what we're doing, especially in the nuclear space, President Trump, when he was in office, was a great supporter of the industry and really understood, I think, ahead of some others, that we're not going to be able to run a full-time economy just on part-time power. And President Biden and President Trump have uniformly supported the technology. So I wouldn't expect a change, but certainly public policy is always going to be one of the drivers in the energy industry for what actually happens.
So there's federal public policy, and then there's state and state and local. I mean, is that, how much is that on your mind these days, in terms of, I mean, beyond, you know, the sort of PUCs of the world, but just in terms of legislators who, you know, are keeping an eye on the electricity demand and wanting to, say, protect their constituents, the general public, from rising costs and that kind of thing, particularly if electricity supply ends up going to more and more large load customers.
Yeah, Leila, I think there's a dimension of this that involves state policymakers for sure. Now, remember, they're in an interstate grid. So the fact that a particular state doesn't build a data center, doesn't electrify vehicles, doesn't mean that you're not going to see rising costs as a result of demand in adjacent states, as an example, or that economic development. So I think the policymakers we talk to certainly are sophisticated enough to know that one state's decision on AI, as an example, isn't going to fundamentally change supply and demand for electricity if the states around are doing these data centers. So it becomes a question of how they attract. And what we've seen is a strong interest in these states to attract the economic development, to be part of this new developing technology, to have the data centers, to have the things that the data centers could do in terms of innovation in life sciences, material sciences, and other things occur in their states. So I think that's something that I expect folks to continue to look at. And then the last dimension is just jobs. There are tens of thousands of jobs that this new economy is going to demand. And so that's a great thing. And in particular, if you think about it, the places where we have nuclear plants often are in some of the most distressed communities that used to be heavy in industry. But as that industry has migrated away, there hasn't been a replacement job for a lot of folks. So it's a pretty exciting thing to not only bring this technology, this customer, nearer to the plants, but to be able to share with this community that we live in all of the economic benefits associated with that.
So kind of touching on that topic, you know, the physical location of your plants and where some of the build out may happen. Another audience question is, will you use land around existing nuclear plants to co-locate data centers? I think that's the idea. Would you, and secondarily, they're asking about SMR, so we'll get into that right afterwards. But how are you looking in terms of like what physically will this build out look like? You've mentioned before co-locating, but you know, how does that look? Is that the main way that you envision this this growth happening when it comes to data center and potentially other large customers?
I don't think that I envision a main way. I think Constellation will continue to sell to all kinds of industry players, right? The 75% of the Fortune 100 for whatever they want for on-grid connected energy demand. I think co-location will be a subset of overall data center growth, and it'll be focused on those data centers that are larger, the ones that we talked about earlier in the interview that are multiple times larger than the grid connected. I think that's a special application where it absolutely makes sense to bring that demand very close to the power generation So that we don't have to build these expensive transmission lines and substations and permit them all over the system. So I think it's going to unfold in both ways, and the land adjacent to the nuclear plants or land that we already own, because we bought a lot of land around the plants, is going to be useful for the co-located data centers. And likewise, I know you're going to get to SMRs, but it's the same sort of thing. Talked about it on our earnings call. I think, in my view, the most likely place to put the next generation reactor is going to be in locations where communities already have enjoyed a successful relationship with nuclear, where the nuclear plants have been there for decades. We tend to be very valued neighbors because of the amount of taxes we pay, the employment we bring to the area. Our communities like us a lot. And that's really good when you're siting the next reactor, as opposed to just putting it in a community that has never interfaced with the nuclear industry. In fact, when I think of the capabilities of our company, I think one of the most exciting capabilities is to utilize this land around our facilities for new nuclear, for other commercial development, including data centers, because again, the community has already grown up with a nuclear plant there and is comfortable with its presence and the industrial activity that it could create.
Okay, and so one of the first questions here was, what is your plan to deploy SMRs? And I'll just throw in new nuclear technology at large. So small modular reactors.
Yeah, I think there's an ongoing debate, really, and I think it's a good and healthy debate of whether or not the next generation reactors are going to be these big, large-scale reactors, the ones I referenced earlier, that could be very large, but also very pricey and take a long time to build, with the idea of smaller modular reactors. And the theory there is that we could take big component parts of the reactors, we could build them in factories, we don't have to do all the on-site building. You transport them to the location and you connect it, much like we do natural gas plants and wind farms and solar farms today, right, with these kind of components. And it's an exciting time. A lot of different companies have put designs out there. Constellation has been in the middle of a lot of this design work. Many of the companies seek us out because while we don't design new reactors per se, we operate far and away the largest fleet in America. So we have a great deal of expertise in terms of how the plants will operate. And there's a big difference between seeing a good blueprint design and understanding whether it's going to work really well in the real world in which we operate. So we've already partnered, shared technology with a lot of these developers. We have a small business relationship with Rolls-Royce, and that was developing some technology over in Europe that can transfer back here. So, the way we think about it right now is we've got to see these technologies evolve. We've got to see folks prove out the competency. I think they'll do that in the next 5 or 6 years. And then we'll select the technologies that best suit our needs and our customers' needs at the sites. So, it's a TBD in terms of which technology we're ultimately going to select. I think there's a significant possibility we'll work with a number of different vendors. But some of that work, that evaluation work, will go along with our customers here in the next few years. Then we'll pick a technology, get through licensing, and get through the construction. Everybody always asks, well, when you put all those pieces together, how long is that going to take before you have a small modular reactor up? I think for Constellation, it's early 2030s. So a lot of work going on now, but it'll be nearly a decade, I think, before those resources are producing energy.
And where does nuclear fusion, another audience question, where does nuclear fusion sit in Constellation's tech strategy?
I think it's a big part of the strategy. So we signed a deal with Microsoft and Helion, a developer of fusion technology. I was on a call with their management team the other day. As a matter of fact, they're working on the 6th generation of their fusion reactor, which is smaller scale, more deployable than some of the early work on fusion. So I'm actually pretty excited by that. And it takes a lot for me to get pumped up about fusion, because I'll be honest with you, when I was coming out as an engineer, I thought that I would spend my life in the fusion field, and it was kind of right around the corner. So I totally get those who have said that, fusion is the technology of the future and always will be. But I think there have been some exciting breakthroughs, and I could see that again in the 2030s being a technology that allows us to get there. Here's what I'm absolutely sure about. We have to have a pretty wide aperture when we think about this energy transition. It's not just the data centers or the electric vehicles, but from an industry perspective, 80% of the energy that's consumed in American industry is still coming from fossil fuels. So if we're literally going to transition all of these different things, we're not going to just be able to do it with wind and solar. I think those are great technologies. We enable a lot of that, and they may play the dominant role. But we're going to need things that operate in a more predictable way, like advanced nuclear, like dispatchable gas-fired generation with sequestration. And I'm really pumped up that we're in the middle of that. And I think fusion is going to have an exciting role to play in that, because again, what it promises isn't just clean, abundant energy, but it promises predictability, which is the mother's milk of our industry.
Okay, and on the topic of small modular reactors, and I know that that's looking like it may be a next decade type of thing, but is Constellation applying? Is it planning to apply to the NRC, to federal regulators to be an operator of such technology?
We will not have, if our thesis is right, that the next gen of nuclear technology is going to be sited at places where there already are existing plants. And we have more of those sites than anyone in the country, quite obviously, because we have more plants. Then I think that's an opportunity for us. And I wouldn't want to have a different operator at our site. We would have to operate anything that's on our site. So that's a long way of saying to you, if it's built where we have reactors and on our land, we're going to operate those units. No one else will.
Okay, and that hasn't happened so far. I think that's public record.
No.
I could look it up, but I don't. Okay, got it.
No. We're not at that stage yet, but I think that's probably one of the easiest things to do here, is to convince the NRC that Constellation, the nation's largest operator in nuclear plants, is going to operate the next version of it.
On the topic of new forms of energy supply, could we talk a bit about hydrogen? How important is clean hydrogen development for Constellation right now, given all of the renewed interest in nuclear? Is it still something that you're working towards? What does that look like?
When you think about the cost of the infrastructure to make the hydrogen gas, it's almost kind of like a data center, in the sense that you're not going to buy all of that equipment and then just run it when you have electricity, because the wind is blowing and the sun is out. So you're going to want to run that 24/7 to make it as efficient as possible. So again, it's a pretty good companion for existing nuclear or gas-fired generation with perfect sequestration. So yeah, I think hydrogen could be an exciting technology for us. There is a lot of rulemaking that is still going on at Treasury in terms of the interpretation of the Inflation Reduction Act. We've been very outspoken that we think hydrogen for industrial uses, making fertilizer, sustainable aviation, and other transportation fuels, and some of the things that hydrogen is already being used for in industry, replacing that with clean hydrogen is a great means of advancing the energy transition. I think we could be the producers of a lot of that hydrogen, but we have to have a good rulemaking structure. And right now we don't. Quite honestly, we've been in loggerheads really with the early proposed rules that have come out of the administration. And so we're hoping that that gets resolved, and I'm confident it will. And I think hydrogen is going to be a part of the strategy. The other thing, but kind of moving away from why this is important to Constellation, it's important to America for all the industrial demand reasons we're talking about, and also as a means of reducing the carbon intensity of the natural gas-fired generation that we already have. That's really important from an electric reliability standpoint. So we set a world record at one of our plants last year where we blended natural gas and almost 40% hydrogen to produce electricity. So that was pretty exciting. And we think a lot of the existing gas turbines out there can blend hydrogen and significantly reduce emissions. So the country's got to figure this out, but it could be a big part of our energy transition story if we do it right.
And in terms of that interpretation of the IRA and just sort of guidance from the Treasury, do you have hopes, or what are the levels of your hopes currently, that the hydrogen production tax credit will be more friendly to nuclear?
Well, I think there has been an overwhelming response from industry and others, the nuclear industry, of course, but the power industry and others, saying that, look, this quite simply has to be part of our strategy. If we don't use nuclear, we're not going to develop the hydrogen economy. I think the best example of that is what's happened to the hydrogen hubs. A lot of these hubs were announced with great fanfare. Then we had Treasury rules come out, and it wasn't just the nuclear pieces. There were other pieces of it that just didn't make sense for the participants in those hubs and start resonating. Look, we won't know till we're done. But I think what's important here is the folks who drafted the IRA, and I'm talking the Senator Mansions of the world and others who were critical in the crafting of that document, have been very outspoken that the will of Congress, the intent of Congress, was for existing nuclear, existing hydro and other resources to be used to make hydrogen. They understood that, and they've been very vocal about it. Look, this could end up being one of these situations where we simply disagree with the final rules that are issued. If we don't get the relief in this next stage, then we'll have to make a decision whether to go to courts and really test whether the administration is properly interpreting the will of Congress as expressed in the statutory language. For my part, I'm 100% confident that we are right in our position, and that if we have to go to court, we will prevail at the end of the day in that. So look, I'm hopeful we'll get there through the rulemaking process. Again, think the arguments are resonating, but at the end of the day, one way or the other, nuclear and hydrogen will go together like peanut butter and jelly.
Do you see any difference between administrations? I mean, just given that we're in this election year, on that specific issue, just sort of, a change of guards affecting anything when it comes to this type of interpretation and the friendliness towards existing nuclear for hydrogen?
I don't, the whole hydrogen economy discussion largely occurred post President Trump's time in office. So I don't think we have a kind of any robust history. As an example, I mentioned several times here how President Trump was a strong supporter, and Secretary Perry under him were strong supporters of nuclear and realized the importance. But at that time, we weren't talking about hydrogen or thinking about it as much. That really came up in the early days of the Biden administration as they started to look at what the Europeans and others were doing with hydrogen. So I don't know is the answer as to how President Trump would interpret this. And, I think these interpretation issues, agency issues, occupy a lot of time in courts for a reason. And I'm not sure that it's Democrats or Republicans necessarily that drive those court cases. I think there's often these situations where the administrative process in creating rules differs, in terms of how parties view the legislative intent.
Got it. Okay. And just on the hydrogen hub point, what is the status of Constellation's LaSalle hydrogen infrastructure? What is the status of it if the credits don't end up being that helpful?
Well, we've been very, very candid that if the credits, if we can't use existing nuclear to make hydrogen, then it makes absolutely no sense to build a hydrogen facility at an existing nuclear plant. So we have alerted folks that if it goes in that direction as a final rule, we will terminate our involvement with the hub reluctantly, but we have no other choice. Again, I'm confident that arguments are resonating and we're going to end up in a different position, but that's what's going on. But in anticipation of ending up in a better spot, we've continued the work with the Department of Energy and other stakeholders, and we've remained at the table. Everybody's kind of holding their breath, waiting for this. The IRA created a tremendous amount of work for Treasury and all sorts of rules. So it's not like they're dragging their feet or anything. It's just there's a lot going on at the agency right now, and we're hopeful that they'll get to this before the end of the year, and we can make a decision to go or no go.
Okay, that makes sense. Well, I think we're pretty much at the end of our time, but was there anything, any final thoughts on Constellation strategy that we didn't touch on that you might want to put it into our heads before we go?
No, I think we've covered that. I think, probably the last thought is for well over 100 years, this industry, Constellation proudly included, has solved for the needs of America. And as long as we're able to use our innovation, have a lot of choices, keep that aperture wide, as I said earlier, I'm confident whatever demand from data centers, electric vehicles, or industrial electrification occurs, I am super confident that the industry is going to be able to meet that. I say that because we're in this interesting time, and of course, all the conversations around the energy transition are a part of this, but we're in this interesting time where we do a lot of hand-wringing in this business and in the general discourse about, can we power electric vehicles? Can we power data? And we've got to be able to do those things, right? If we're not part of the leadership of the data economy from an innovation perspective, pharmaceutical businesses and other businesses in America are going to suffer. But I think the importance of the technology to our geopolitical safety, military applications, all of those things are deeply linked to our ability to maintain this democracy. So I'm hopeful that in the coming weeks and months, we could transition away from, oh my God, the sky is falling, we have more electricity demand, to a more principled discussion about how we tackle that and how we maintain America's leadership. We've done it for well over 100 years. We'll do it for the next 100 years quite easily. We just got to kind of start moving away from the sky is falling conversation each and every time we're going to produce another megawatt hour of demand on the system. It's not helpful, and I think gets us spinning our wheels in the wrong direction.
Okay, well, thank you for your time. I appreciate it. It was really nice talking.
Great talking to you. Thanks, everybody. Have a good morning.